Welcome back, everyone. If you are here for the first time, you have chosen exactly the right story to begin with, because what I am about to tell you is one of those tales that starts in the quiet and ends in something that shakes everything you thought you understood about loyalty, about power, and about the kind of love that survives across centuries. My name is familiar to those of you who come back every week, and if you have been here before, you already know that I do not rush. I do not skip the parts that matter. I let the story breathe, because these are the kinds of stories that deserve to be felt, not just heard. So get comfortable. Find your spot. And if you are already subscribed to this channel, thank you genuinely, because your presence here makes every single story worth telling. And if you are not yet subscribed, there is a button right below this video, and I want you to press it now before we go any further, because I promise you that by the end of tonight, you will not want to miss what comes next. Now, let us begin in the mountains. Not just any mountains. The kind that have names in languages no longer spoken. The kind where the tree line ends not because of altitude, but because something old and territorial decided long ago that certain ground belongs to different creatures entirely. The kind of mountains where the wind does not simply blow, but seems to carry intent, where the silence between sounds holds more meaning than the sounds themselves. These are the Draveth Peaks, and they have been the territory of the Asheville Pack for longer than any living member of the pack can accurately trace. The records go back 400 years in the official ledgers kept by the pack's historians. But the elders, those few ancient wolves who rarely speak and rarely smile, will sometimes say when pressed that the Asheville presence in these mountains predates written record entirely, that the pack did not come to the Draveth Peaks, that the Draveth Peaks in some sense came to them. Aldrich Voss had grown up with that mythology, the way other children grow up with fairy tales, as something beautiful and mostly untrue, the kind of story that explains a people to themselves without necessarily explaining anything real. She had been born in the eastern valley of the territory, the daughter of Aldrich Voss, who had been a tracker of considerable reputation before his disappearance when Seren was 9 years old. The official record, such as it was, stated that Aldrich Voss had been lost during a boundary patrol, that a storm had come in fast and without warning, and that his body had never been recovered. It was a clean and simple explanation. It was the kind of explanation that, when you are 9 and grieving and desperate to understand, you accept because there is nothing else on offer. Seren had accepted it. She had carried it with her through the years of growing up without him, through the years of training to follow his path as a EE tracker. Through every morning she stood at the eastern boundary of the territory and looked out into the landscape where the official story said he had simply vanished. She had accepted it, but she had never quite believed it. She was 24 years old now, and she was the pack's primary tracker, which was a title that sounded more impressive than it generally felt in daily practice. The Asheville Pack was led by Alpha Karan Mael, a man of 53 who had held power for nearly 2 decades, and who held it with the particular confidence of someone who has never seriously been challenged. He was not cruel, not in the obvious ways. He did not punish without stated reason. He did not take what was not technically his to take, but there was something in the way he held a room, something in the way conversations rearranged themselves around his presence, that had always made Seren feel as though she was perpetually standing slightly outside the circle of things that truly mattered. She told herself this was grief speaking. She told herself it was the particular loneliness of a girl who had lost her father young and had compensated by becoming extremely competent and extremely quiet. She told herself many reasonable things. The tracker's role within the Asheville Pack was not glamorous. It was necessary, it was respected in the abstract, and it was deeply unglamorous in the specific. Seren spent her days walking the boundary lines of the territory, checking the marker stones, cataloging the signs of animal movement, investigating the occasional incursion of unfamiliar scent that might signal a rogue or a scout from a neighboring pack. She filed her reports with the Alpha's Administrative Council, a group of 4 wolves, including an elder named Baith, who had been on the council for 30 years, and who had the particular tendency of older, powerful people to listen to younger, competent people. With an expression of patient tolerance, that communicated almost nothing. She filed her reports. She walked her lines. She was good at her job, and largely invisible in the way that essential infrastructure is invisible. It was in her third week of autumn that she first noticed the eagle. It appeared on a Tuesday morning, which in itself was not remarkable. Golden eagles nested in the Draveth Peaks, had done so for as long as anyone remembered, and a tracker seeing an eagle in the mountains was as unremarkable as a fisherman seeing water. But this eagle was different, in a way that Seren could not immediately articulate, and therefore spent 3 days trying to articulate in the private journal she kept not for official purposes but for her own, the one where she wrote down the things she noticed that did not belong in official reports. The eagle was large, larger than the breeding pair she had tracked for the last 2 seasons, large enough that her first sighting of it produced a strange doubling sensation, the part of her brain that processed size. Recalculating several times, it sat on the ridge above the eastern boundary marker, the one closest to where her father had disappeared, and it watched. That was the word. Not observed, not scanned, not hunted. Watched, with the particular directed attention of something that had chosen its subject deliberately. She noted it in her private journal. She did not include it in her official report. The second sighting was 4 days later, and this time the eagle was not on the ridge, but in the valley below the Pack's main settlement, perched on an outcropping of granite that jutted from the hillside like a tooth. It was watching the settlement. Watching, as far as Seren could tell from the direction of its head, the longhouse where the Pack's council met. She stood at a distance and watched it watch the longhouse for 20 minutes before it spread its wings, which were extraordinary, wide enough that her breath caught involuntarily, and rose without particular hurry into the thermals. Above the valley, she noted it in her private journal. She did not include it in her official report. The third sighting was when things began to shift. She was walking the northern boundary, which wound through a section of old-growth forest so dense that full sunlight only reached the ground for approximately 2 hours at midday. And she was in that particular focused state that came with detailed tracking work, reading the ground for signs that she had been trained to read the way some people read words, as effortlessly as breathing, when she became aware of a weight of attention above her. She looked up, and the eagle was in the branches of a fir tree 20 feet overhead, and it was looking at her. Not at the territory, not at the settlement. At her specifically, with an attention so direct and so concentrated that for one disorienting moment, she forgot entirely that she was looking at a bird. She looked at it. It looked at her. The forest was completely silent around them. "What are you watching?" she said aloud, which was the kind of thing she did when she was alone and slightly unnerved. Address the thing that was unnerving her directly, as though speaking to it might produce useful information. The eagle tilted its head. Not the involuntary tilt of a startled animal, but the considered deliberate tilt of something processing language. Then it spread its wings, dropped from the branch, and rose through the canopy in a shower of disturbed needles and winter light, and was gone. That evening she included a brief note in her official report. Large, unidentified eagle observed in 3 locations over 12-day period. Behavior atypical. Recommend monitoring. She submitted this to the council and received 2 days later a response from Elder Baith that read, "Noted. Continue standard observation protocols," which was, she had learned, council language for "we have read this and have decided it does not require our direct attention." She continued standard observation protocols. The eagle continued appearing. Over the course of the next 3 weeks, it became something she tracked alongside her official duties, the way you track a persistent anomaly, with careful notes and building pattern recognition. It appeared most frequently at the eastern boundary, least frequently in the Pack's central territory, and never, she noted, on the western side, where the territory bordered a river valley that the Pack used primarily for fishing during the summer. Months. It watched the settlement. It watched the council building. It watched Elder Baith specifically, she realized after the 4th week, which was a realization that arrived with a cold clarity that she immediately distrusted. She distrusted it because it seemed too pointed, too story-shaped. the kind of coincidence that appears meaningful rather than the kind that simply is. But the data was the data. When Baith moved through the settlement, the eagle's attention followed him. When Baith was inside, the eagle waited. When Baith emerged, the eagle's head moved. And at every possible opportunity, across every terrain and every weather condition, the eagle watched Seren. It was in the 5th week of autumn, on a morning when the first real frost had laid itself across the mountain meadows like a held breath, that Alpha Corin called her into his office. She had been in his office perhaps 6 times in the 2 years since she had formally taken the tracker's role, and each time had been brief, professional, and almost entirely unmemorable. She knew his office the way she knew all practical spaces, in terms of its function and layout, the broad desk, the shelving of territorial maps that went back decades, the single window that looked toward the eastern ridge. She did not know Corin Mael particularly well, because he did not appear to want to be known particularly well. And Seren, who had learned early that wanting things from people who did not wish to give them was an exercise in diminishment, had never pushed. He looked tired when she came in. Not the ordinary tired of administrative burden, but something older. Something that sat behind his eyes like weather sitting behind the mountains, heavy and patient and waiting to break. He said that there had been deaths in the villages at the base of the Dreveth Peaks. 3 villages across a span of 40 miles. 6 deaths in the past 4 weeks. All of them found in circumstances that the human authorities were calling animal attacks, but that the pack's contacts in those communities had described in terms that suggested something considerably more complex. The wounds were wrong for ordinary predators. The patterns of the attacks were wrong. Something was moving through the lowland communities at the base of pack territory, and it was not something ordinary. He needed someone to investigate quietly, professionally, and without drawing the kind of attention that a larger team would draw. He needed someone who was good at moving through landscape without being noticed, and who was good at reading situations that did not announce themselves clearly. He needed a tracker. She asked if she would have support. He said she would have the resources of the council and could call for backup if the situation escalated beyond a single investigator's capacity. He said this in the tone of someone who is given an assurance that both parties understand to be largely performative. She recognized the tone. She had been recognizing it from various sources since she was old enough to understand subtext. She said yes. She said it without visible hesitation, because visible hesitation was not something she indulged in front of the Alpha, and because in the honest part of herself she was not hesitating at all. She was, in fact, feeling the particular alertness that came with an assignment that meant something, even if she could not yet say what it meant or why. The eastern boundary, the deaths, the eagle on the ridge above the place where her father had disappeared. She could not have explained the connection she felt instinctively, and would not have tried to explain it in that room, but it was there. She left for the lowlands the following morning, before the frost had thawed. The eagle was on the ridge when she crossed the eastern boundary. She did not stop to look at it, but she knew it was there. If you are already feeling things about where this story is going, I want you to drop a comment below right now, even if it is just the word eagle, just so I know you are here with me, because the next part of this story is where everything you think you know begins to come apart, and I want to know how many of you felt it before it happened. Drop your comment. I will be reading every single one. The first village was called Thresh, a settlement of perhaps 200 people arranged around a crossroads market that had been operating in the same location for 3 generations. Serene reached it on foot in half a day's walk from the boundary, having shifted to her human form for the descent through the farmland, which was the pragmatic choice rather than the comfortable one. She preferred running on 4 legs through open terrain, but she preferred not being shot by nervous farmers more than she preferred comfort. She wore ordinary clothes, carried a pack with what appeared to be hiking equipment, and presented to the human villagers as exactly what she was in her cover: a wildlife researcher investigating reports of unusual predator activity. The story she heard in Thresh from a woman named Ida, who ran the Crossroads Inn, was not the story she had expected, which was itself information. She had expected something consistent with the Alpha's briefing. Animal attacks, wounds of an unusual nature, the kind of incident that required a tracker's assessment of what predator was responsible. What she got from Ida over tea that was mostly an excuse for Ida to talk to. Someone who was listening was something more complicated. The first victim in Thresh had not been found in open country. He had been found inside his home, in a locked room, with no signs of forced entry. The wounds on his body were consistent with large claws. Yes, but the placement was wrong for any predator Seren knew, and there had been something in the room with him when he died, something Ida described hesitantly, almost embarrassed by the word she reached for. A smell, cold and clean and on, very old, like the inside of a stone chamber that has not been opened in centuries. Seren wrote this down. She thanked Ida. She left. The second village was 4 hours northeast, a place called Varden's Cross, and the account she received there from a retired farmer who had been the one to find the second and third victims was consistent with Thresh in the most important detail. The smell. Cold, stone, old, as though the killer, whatever it was, carried the scent of somewhere sealed away from the world for a very long time. The farmer added one detail that Thresh had not offered. He said that on the morning after the second death, he had been standing at the window of his house at dawn and had seen something in the field behind the building. He said he could not describe it clearly because the light was bad, and he was afraid, and afraid people did not always see accurately. But he thought it had been large. He thought it had been looking back at him. And he thought, though this was the part he was most embarrassed to say, that for just a moment it had not looked like one thing, but like two things overlapping. A large shape, and within the large shape a human silhouette. The way a transparency laid over a photograph makes both images visible at once. Seren drove back to her camp in the forest at the base of the Draveth Peaks and sat with her notes for a long time in the dark, and thought about the smell of sealed stone and the outline of a human shape inside an animal's body, and felt the particular sensation she had learned over years of tracking to respect, the sensation of having found the edge of something vast, like standing at the rim of a gorge in the dark and knowing by the changed quality of the air that there is open space before you even before you can see the drop. She did not sleep well. She was up before dawn, moving through the forest toward the southern boundary of the territory to check the third village on her list, when she heard behind her the sound of something large in the upper branches of the trees. She stopped, turned. The eagle was there, 20 feet up, watching her with the same concentrated attention that had been following her for weeks now. In the pre-dawn dark, its eyes caught the faint ambient light and reflected it back in two small bright points that were impossible and beautiful and deeply unsettling. "You followed me down," she said, not a question. The eagle looked at her. "What do you know?" she said, and even as she said it, she understood how absurd it was, standing in a dark forest talking to a bird, except that every instinct she had trained and trusted across years of work was telling her that it was not absurd at all, that she was talking to something that understood her, and that the thing that understood her was choosing its moment with a deliberateness that she recognized because she practiced it herself. She turned back toward the village path. She took 3 steps. Then she heard behind her a sound that stopped her so completely that for a moment she was not sure her body would let her move again. It was not an eagle sound. It was the sound of something large changing, the sound that shift forms made in moments of transformation, a sound she had heard all her life and had always known, but which she had never heard from a source that was supposed to be a bird. And then there was silence, a different silence from the forest silence, the silence of something standing behind her and waiting for her to turn around. She turned around. He was tall, taller than most of the men she knew in the pack, and he stood in the space where the eagle had been with the particular stillness of something that was not accustomed to having a physical form to arrange. He was dressed in clothes that made no sense for the season or the century, something between what hunters wore 100 years ago and what the marked wanderers in the old territorial histories were described as wearing. Fitted leather and rough cloth, and across the back and arms and throat, the unmistakable deep marks of runes carved not into wood or stone, but into skin. His hair was dark. His face was the kind of face that had been young a very long time ago, and then had stopped aging. not in the way of vanity or preservation, but in the way of things that exist outside the ordinary processes of time. His eyes were amber, the same amber as the eagle's eyes. She registered this with the calm part of her brain that kept processing data even when the rest of her was doing something considerably less calm. He said, in a voice that had the quality of stone chambers and old silence, "You have your father's eyes. He always looked at the world like he was about to find something true in it. The world did not stop. That is what people say, that time stops, that the world stops. But it does not. It keeps moving. The trees kept breathing in the cold air. The frost kept forming on the grass. Her own heartbeat kept its ordinary rhythm with only the smallest interruption before she disciplined it back. What happened was more internal than a stoppage of the world. What happened was that something she had carried for 15 years, some particular weight in the architecture of her grief, shifted, moved, created new pressure in new places. She said, "Who are you?" He said, "My name is Calum. I was sentenced to watch this pack 312 years ago by the Primordial Council, of which your Alpha's bloodline was, at the time, a member. The sentence was permanent. The eagle form was the price of my continued existence. I have been watching the Asheville Pack for 3 centuries, and what I have watched in the last 15 years is the reason I chose to reveal myself to you." She said, "What did you watch 15 years ago?" He said, "I watched your father die, and I watched the hand that killed him. Tell me you are still breathing. Tell me in the comments right now, because I need to know. Just type, 'still breathing,' and I will know you have arrived at this moment with me. Because this is exactly what I meant when I said this story starts quiet. This is where it breaks open. She did not fall apart. This is important, because it would have been understandable to fall apart, and because she was aware in that moment of 2 competing impulses that were both entirely real. The impulse that belonged to the 9-year-old who had lost her father in a clean and official story that had never felt complete, and the impulse that belonged to the 24-year-old tracker who understood that falling apart in the field was not something she could afford. Not before she had collected everything this source had to offer. Not before she understood the shape of what she was dealing with. The 9-year-old would have her moment. Later. Not now. "Tell me everything," she said. And her voice was level, which was one of the more extraordinary things her body had ever done for her. Calum looked at her for a long moment with those amber eyes that had been watching for 3 centuries, and she thought she saw in them something she had not expected, something that complicated the solemnity of the moment in a way that made the complicated parts of her feel suddenly more complex. He looked at her like she had looked at him, with the attention of something recognizing something, like a tracker who has been following a trail for a very long time and has come around a bend and found what they were looking for standing there, solid and real, and exactly where the sign said it would be. He said, "Then let us find shelter. This will take time, and I have been carrying it for 15 years. They made camp in a hollow between 3 old trees that the frost had not yet reached, and he built a fire with a competence that she noted with the automatic noting she gave to all competence regardless of context. He sat across the fire from her, and she sat across from him, and in the space between them the fire crackled, and the night held still around them, and he began. His name before the eagle form had been Calum Dravast. He had been a primordial, one of the ancient class of shifters who predated pack structure and territorial division, beings of considerable power whose existence the modern pack system had largely bureaucratized into irrelevance. The Primordial Council had been the governing body of shifter society for centuries, before the pack alphas consolidated. Power in a series of political arrangements that the histories called the Great Compact, and that Calum, who had been present for it, called something considerably less complimentary. In the Great Compact, the alphas had essentially absorbed primordial authority into the pack structure, granting primordials nominal seats in territorial governance while stripping them of actual jurisdiction. Most primordials had accepted this because they were practical and because the alternative was a conflict that nobody wanted. Calum had not accepted it. Calum had been, in his own words, difficult about it. He had specifically been difficult about the practice that the Asheville Alpha of the time, a man named Corvin Mayle, who was the great-great-grandfather of the current Alpha, had introduced to the Eastern Territories, the systematic suppression of bloodlines that predated pack registration, the primordial families, the old guardian lineages, the lunar-bound clans who traced their shifting forms to sources older than any compact. Corvin Mile had argued, persuasively and with considerable political skill, that unregistered bloodlines were a destabilizing force in the new compact order, and that the integrity of territorial governance required that all shifters be properly within the pack structure. What this had meant in practice was that families who refused registration had been removed, forcibly in several cases, from territory they had occupied for generations. Their records were expunged from official histories. Their children were given the choice of registration under Mile lineage or exile. Calum had objected loudly and formally to 3 separate council sessions. He had presented evidence of what was happening in the Eastern Territories and had demanded investigation. He had made enemies, which was the predictable result of making accurate accusations about powerful people. The council had sentenced him for disruption of compact order and conflict with Alpha. Authority. The sentence had been creative in the particular way of people who want to keep someone contained but cannot justify outright execution. Permanent shift, permanent watch, permanent witness. He was to take eagle form and watch the Asheville territory for as long as the sentence held. He could not speak. He could not act. He could only watch. 312 years of watching. You could shift now, Seren said. You are shifted now. How? He was quiet for a moment in the way of someone consulting internal evidence. The sentence was maintained by the Compact's authority. The Compact's authority is vested in the Council and in the bloodlines it recognizes. When a bloodline ends, a piece of the Compact's authority ends with it. 15 years ago, when your father died, a piece of the sentence broke. Not enough to free me entirely, but enough to give me occasional human form, if I choose carefully and not too often. A pause. I have been choosing this moment for 15 years. The fire crackled. She waited. Your father, he said, was Aldrich Voss. Before the Voss name, before the registration your grandfather accepted under duress, the family name was something older, something that the Compact's records do not contain because the Compact's records were specifically purged of it. Your bloodline is primordial, Seren. Not entirely, not the full lineage, but enough. Enough that your father's existence was, to certain people, a complication. He had begun asking questions. He had found documents in the Pack's own archive that should have been destroyed, but had not been. Documents that referenced the bloodline suppression in Corvin Male's era by name. He had come to the eastern boundary to meet a contact who had promised to provide additional evidence. The Alpha of the time was Coran Male's predecessor. But Coran Male was already on the council. And Coran Male knew what your father had found. She said, Coran Male killed my father. He said, Elder. Beath carried the order. Coran Male gave it. The fire was very quiet for a long time. This is the moment I want you to take a breath. Not because it is over, but because what comes next is where Seren decides what kind of person she is. And I think you need to be steady when you hear it. And if you want to talk about this moment, about what it means that a man spent 3 centuries trying to hold a sentence together, long enough to reach this girl, I want to read your thoughts in the comments. I read everyone. She was quiet for longer than the 9-year-old in her wanted to be. She was quiet for precisely as long as the tracker in her needed to process, sort, and begin to assess what she was working with. Then she said, You cannot testify. You are not a recognized person under the Compact's structure. He said that was correct. She said, The documents my father found. Do you know where they are? He said he knew where they had been when Aldrich Voss had been carrying them. 15 years ago. He did not know what had happened to them after. She said, But you were there. You saw everything. He said he had seen everything for 312 years. She said, Then you remember it. Everything documented in your memory is evidence of what you witnessed. He was quiet for a moment. He said, I have never thought of it that way. She said, I have. She was a tracker. She read terrain. She read signs. She read the difference between what it is trying to show you. What the landscape of this situation was showing her was a path, narrow and technically complex, and requiring very careful navigation. But a path. She had a witness of 3 centuries. She had a name, and a name behind the name. She had the deaths in the lowland villages, which she had not yet connected to the current Alpha, but which something in her instincts was already connecting. The timing, the location near the eastern boundary, near whatever was left of her father's trail. And she realized as she sat across the fire from Salem Drivast and felt the complicated weight of his amber gaze, an ally who had been waiting precisely and specifically for her. "Why me?" she said. "You could have chosen anyone. You have had occasional human form for 15 years. He said, "The sentence breaks when the bloodline it was meant to suppress resurfaces strongly enough to register on the compact's own authority. I have had approximately 40 minutes of human form in the last 15 years. I have been counting them carefully. They began to increase when you formally took the tracker's role. A pause that was not exactly uncomfortable, but was not exactly comfortable either. Your father's blood in a primordial line activated the sentence's weakest points, but it is you specifically who is breaking it. Your presence in the territory, your work at the boundaries, something in the way you move through this landscape as though you belong to it, in a way that goes beyond registration." She thought about 15 years of walking boundary lines that her instincts told her she was qualified to walk in ways the official record did not account for. She thought about the way she had always felt at the eastern boundary in particular, the way the landscape there seemed to carry a frequency her body recognized without being able to name. She thought about her father, and the word primordial, and what it meant to have carried something in your blood that the powerful had tried to erase, and had only partially succeeded in erasing. She said, "The lowland deaths, what is causing them?" He said, "Something sealed. Something very old that was sealed in the eastern boundary and is beginning to come loose." She said, "Sealed by whom?" He said, "By the compact's authority. By the Mile bloodline specifically, 300 years ago. Something that knew what the bloodlines they were suppressing truly were." She said, "Something that was supposed to stay sealed." He said, "Yes, and the sentence that holds me was the same authority that holds the seal. As I weaken, it weakens." She looked at him across the fire and understood several things at once with the particular clarity of a tracker who has found the central thread from which all the other threads hang. His freedom was tied to her. The seal in the eastern boundary was tied to both of them. The deaths in the villages were the consequence of the seal's instability, and at the center of all of it, holding the official history together with an authority he had inherited rather than built, was Coran Mile, who had given an order when he was a young council member and had spent 2 decades as Alpha with that order buried and silent. Until now. "I need you to trust me," she said, "and I need you to understand what trust costs me to ask from someone I have known for approximately 4 hours. He said, "I have been watching you for 5 weeks. I have been watching your bloodline for 3 centuries. Ask," she said. "I am going to go back into the territory and find whatever my father left. Whatever he was carrying when he died, wherever it ended up, there will be a trace. I am a tracker. This is what I do." She paused. "And I need you to come with me. Not as the eagle. As this." She gestured at him. At the whole improbable solid fact of him sitting across her fire in his centuries-old clothes with his rune-marked skin. "Because I cannot walk back into a situation this complex without someone who has seen the whole history of it." He was quiet for a long time, and she let him be quiet, which was one of the things she was genuinely good at, letting important silences be what they needed to be without filling them with noise. Then he said, and his voice was different, slightly, the quality of stone chambers still present, but something warmer beneath it, like the moment before a fire catches. "No one has asked me for anything in 3 centuries. I had forgotten what it felt like." She said, "What does it feel like?" he said very quietly, like something sealed beginning to come loose. She told him to get some sleep if he could, and turned her face back to the fire and tried, with limited success, to tell the 9-year-old inside her that there would be time. The 9-year-old was not entirely convinced, but she was patient, which was something Seren had taught her, and she waited. They moved at first light, Seren in her human form and Calum beside her in his, and it was almost immediately apparent that 3 centuries of eagle-form existence had given him an excellent orientation to the terrain and a complicated relationship with human walking speeds. She did not comment on the several moments where he misjudged the distance to an obstacle or the angle of a slope. He did not comment on the fact that she had noticed. They found a working rhythm within an hour, which was faster than she found working rhythms with most people. And this fact sat in her awareness like a small, unremarkable stone that she would examine more carefully later. She told him as they walked about her 15 years of official tracking and the things she had noted privately that had never made it into the official reports. The patterns at the eastern boundary, the way the land there felt different under her feet and could not be explained by geological survey. The 3 times she had found marker stones disturbed in a way that suggested not animal movement, but deliberate repositioning, as though someone had been trying to shift a boundary line by small increments over many seasons. He listened to all of this with the attentive stillness of someone who has spent centuries developing patience as a survival skill. And when she finished, he said that the marker stones were consistent with what he had observed from above, that someone had been adjusting the eastern boundary line incrementally for at least a decade, and that the direction of the adjustment was consistently outward from the point in the boundary that was closest to the sealed location. She said, "They are trying to move the boundary away from the seal." He said, "They are trying to move the boundary so that the seal technically lies outside the registered territory, outside the pack's jurisdiction." She said, "Because if something goes wrong with the seal, it is no longer their problem." He said, "Because if something emerges from the seal, it can be addressed by claiming it is a rogue outside the territory rather than something the pack created and is responsible for." She stopped walking and looked at the terrain ahead and felt the particular sensation she had named to herself long ago as finding north. The moment when everything that has been approximate and directional becomes fixed and specific, and all the other coordinates arrange themselves accordingly. She said, "Karan Mael knows the seal is weakening. He has known for a while. He is not investigating the lowland deaths. He is managing them, keeping them from being connected to the territory." He said, "Yes," she said. "He sent me to the lowlands." He said, "Yes," she said. "He sent me alone." He said, and the warmth in his voice had taken on a different quality. "Yes, and I want you to understand that the moment I understood that, I stopped choosing my moment carefully and started moving." She looked at him. He looked at her. In the morning light of the Dreveth peaks, the runes on his skin caught the angle of the low sun, and she could see them clearly for the first time. Not decorative, she realized. Not punishment in the aesthetic sense. Each mark was a constraint, a specific limitation written into his form by the compact's authority, and they covered his throat and his forearms and the backs of his hands, and there were so many of them. 3 centuries of them. "Thank you," she said, "for the moving." He said after a moment, "I did not do it for gratitude." She did. Not ask what he did it for. She already knew, in the way she knew terrain, by reading the signs that were there for anyone paying attention. She filed it carefully in the part of her that was not currently tracking a 15-year-old murder, a 3-century-old crime, and an unstable supernatural seal that was killing people in the lowlands, and kept walking. I need you to pause with me for 1 second right here, and just acknowledge the fact that this man spent 312 years watching from above and used every single one of those moments to get to this day. I need a comment that just says 300 years, because I think that deserves to be witnessed. And while you are commenting, hit the like button, because this story has a long way still to go, and your support keeps me bringing these to you every week. The Pack Archive was not a secure facility in the way that truly sensitive information requires a secure facility. It was a building at the edge of the settlement that, contained the official records going back to the founding of the pack under the Great Compact, organized by a system of the late archivist's devising that was elegant in theory and deeply idiosyncratic in practice. Seren had used the archive for reference purposes in her official work and had a general sense of its organization. She had also, in her private tracking of the eastern boundary anomalies, developed a specific hypothesis about where a document that was not supposed to exist would be hidden within a system designed by someone who believed it should not be found. Getting into the archive after hours was not technically difficult. It was a building, not a vault, and she had spent 2 years learning the physical layout of every structure in the settlement as part of her territorial orientation. Getting into the archive with Calum was more complex, not because of the physical logistics, but because of the particular challenge of moving through a shifter settlement with a primordial who had not walked through human spaces in 3 centuries, and who had a tendency to stop and look at things with an attention that made him conspicuous. She managed it by moving them in the hour before dawn, when the settlement was at its quietest, and by the simple expedient of telling him, quietly but firmly, not to look at anything unless it was directly relevant to their objective. He accepted this with good grace. She noted the good grace. The archive in its pre-dawn quiet was a different space from the archive in official working hours, and Seren moved through it in the dark, with the ease of someone who had spent her life reading spaces by available light. The official records were in the front sections, organized by decade and category. What she was looking for was in the back, in the section the late archivist had labeled, with the particular humor of people who keep secrets in plain sight, miscellaneous historical supplementary, which was where documents went that had no clear categorical home, and which was therefore where a document placed there by someone who understood that the best hiding place is the one nobody looks in would wait very patiently for someone who knew to look. She found it in 20 minutes. Calum, standing at her shoulder with the specific quality of attention she was already beginning to recognize as his, the attention that processed everything in its field without commentary, said nothing while she worked. When she found the folder, which was unmarked and contained within it 3 documents and a sealed envelope, she carried it to the small window where the first gray light was beginning and read. The documents were exactly what Calum had described. Correspondence between the Alpha of 15 years ago and Elder Baith, in handwriting she did not recognize for the Alpha, but recognized immediately for Baith. She had seen his hand on 30 official communications, and knew it as well as she knew her own. The correspondence was carefully worded, the kind of careful wording that means something specific while maintaining plausible alternative readings. But she was a tracker, and she read it as it was, rather than as it wanted to appear. An asset has been identified. The asset possesses documentation of historical compact irregularities. The asset must be managed before the documentation reaches wider circulation. The phrase managed before was doing very specific work in that sentence. The second document was in a hand she did not know, and referenced a meeting at the eastern boundary on a specific date 15 years ago. The date was 4 days before her father's disappearance. The meeting had been arranged, according to the document, at Aldrich Voss's request. He had believed he was meeting a sympathetic council contact. The third document was in her father's hand. She knew his handwriting from the 3 letters he had sent her during a winter training expedition when she was 8. The letters she had kept in the bottom of a cedar box under her bed for 15 years. She knew his handwriting so well that seeing it in the archive in the gray pre-dawn light was a physical sensation, like a door opening inward. The document was a letter addressed to the Compact Council, clearly intended for formal submission. It laid out, in her father's precise and careful hand, the history of bloodline suppression in the Asheville territory from the time of Corvin Mile. It named families. It cited the specific compact articles that had been violated. It referenced secondary sources and attached what appeared to be a list of witnesses who could corroborate the historical record. And at the bottom, in a different ink, as though added at the last moment, it said, "If this reaches you without me, find my daughter. She will finish what I started. She has her grandmother's instincts, and she is already beginning to see." She stood at the window with the letter in her hands, and the gray light, coming through the glass, and let the 9-year-old have exactly 30 seconds. 30 seconds of the grief that had been waiting 15 years for permission. Then she folded the letter carefully and put it in her pack next to the other documents and turned around. Caleb was looking at her with an expression she could not fully classify, which was itself unusual for her. She was generally good at reading faces. It was not pity. It was not the careful sympathy of someone managing someone else's emotion. It was something more direct than that. Something that she thought, with the part of herself that was not currently managing a 15-year-old grief and a criminal archive discovery and a supernatural seal emergency, might be recognition. The specific recognition of someone who has also carried something for a very long time and knows what the carrying looks like. She said, "We have what we need." He said, "For the historical case, yes. The seal is a separate problem." She said, "It is not a separate problem. It is the same problem." He was quiet. She said, "Whatever the male bloodline sealed in the eastern boundary 300 years ago, they sealed it using compact authority that they had by virtue of the bloodline suppression. If we can establish that the suppression was illegal, the authority derived from it is also illegal, including the sealing, which means the seal is illegitimate, and whatever is inside it has been illegitimately contained for 3 centuries. He said, "That is technically correct, but practically complicated." She said, "Everything about this is practically complicated. What is in the seal?" He was quiet for longer this time. Then he said, "A guardian, a primordial guardian of the Eastern Mountain Territory, who refused registration under the compact and who was sealed by force when he would not submit. He has been in there for 312 years. She said, "Is he still alive?" He said, "He is not alive in the way you or I are alive. He is sustained by the territory itself. The mountain knows him. It has been keeping him." She thought about the mountains that had names in languages no longer spoken, and the territory that felt under her feet, like recognition, rather than just familiar ground, and the grandmother's instincts her father had mentioned in his letter. She said, "He is why the land in the east feels the way it does." Caleb said very quietly, "He is why the land in the east is what it is." She said, "Then releasing him is not just justice. It is also the only way to stop the seal from breaking catastrophically and killing more people in the lowlands." He said, "Yes," she said, "and releasing him legitimately, through the established channels, requires establishing first that the compact authority used to seal him was fraudulently obtained." He said, "Which requires the documents you are now holding." She said, "Which requires presenting those documents to a council body that currently includes the man who ordered my father's murder." He said, "Yes." She put the documents in her pack and looked at him across the small space of the archive in the growing morning light and said, "I need you to tell me something honestly. Not as a witness, not as a guardian. Honestly. Do you think this can work?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, 3 centuries ago I stood in a council chamber and presented accurate evidence about real crimes to people with the authority to address those crimes, and they sentenced me to watch from above for the rest of my existence. So I do not have an uncomplicated relationship with the concept of institutional process working as intended." A pause. "But I have been watching for 312 years. I have seen the compact's authority shift and bend, and sometimes break. I have seen what happens when the thing that was suppressed resurfaces strongly enough that even the suppression has to acknowledge it. And I have seen what you are." Another pause. Something in his voice that was finding its way toward something honest. "So, yes, I think this can work," she said. "What am I?" He said, "Someone with your father's eyes and your grandmother's instincts, who has been walking boundary lines that belong to your blood for 2 years and has been building a case without knowing it. Someone the land has been preparing for this." She filed this in the part of herself that she would examine later, carefully, when she was not in the middle of an archive in the hour before dawn, with a stolen set of documents and a 3-century-old primordial who had watched her whole life from above, and chose her to be the one he finally spoke to. Later. She would examine all of it later. "Then let us go present accurate evidence to people with authority," she said, and heard the echo of his earlier words in hers, and saw him hear it too. They left the archive as the settlement was beginning to wake, and she was already composing, in the tracker part of her mind, the precise sequence of the next moves. Do not go anywhere. Do not close this video. I mean it. What happens next is the part where Seren stops being the person this story is happening to and starts being the person this story belongs to, and I need you here for it. Drop a still here in the comments and keep watching. She did not go directly to the council. This was the decision that, looking back, made everything else possible. And it was a decision she made not from cowardice, but from the same methodical patience that made her excellent at her work. She went first to 3 people. She went to the Pack's senior historian, a woman named Orla, who was 80 years old and who had outlasted 3 alphas and who had the particular quality of very old people who have watched a great deal of history pass. She was not afraid of inconvenient truth because she had seen too many inconvenient truths to be surprised by them. She went to the Pack's healer, a man named Dewey, who was not a political creature in any sense of the word, but who was deeply respected across every faction of the Pack and whose word carried weight precisely because he never spent it carelessly. And she went to the representative of the Eastern Valley families, a woman named Cass, who was Seren's nearest thing to a friend in the settlement, and who had her own history of boundary line suspicions that she had never been able to articulate clearly enough to raise. Officially, she brought Calum to each of these meetings. She introduced him not as a supernatural figure or a 3-century-old primordial, but as a long-term territorial observer who had documentation of historical events relevant to the Pack's current situation. Orla looked at the runes on his skin for approximately 30 seconds, and then looked at Seren and said, with the economy of someone who does not waste words, "Drivast line." Seren said yes. Orla said, "I thought so. I have been looking for references to the Drivast sentence in the official records for 20 years and finding only the gaps where they were removed." Then she read the documents. Dewey listened to the account of the lowland deaths, with the focused attention of someone whose professional concern was immediate and specific, then listened to the explanation of the seal and its instability, with the focused attention of someone who was rapidly revising their understanding of a problem they had thought they understood. Then he asked 2 precise and excellent questions about the nature of the seal's deterioration and what that deterioration meant for the physical health of anyone in the vicinity of the eastern boundary. Calum answered both questions in terms that were more technical than Seren had expected, and she filed this information about the depth of his specific knowledge for later consideration. Cass read the documents and then said, in a very quiet voice, "There is a marker stone on the eastern boundary line that has been moved 3 times in the last year. I reported it twice. The council said it was environmental shift." She looked at Seren. She looked at Calum. She said, "What do you need from me?" By the time Seren walked into the council chamber 3 days later, she had a historian who had spent 20 years documenting the gaps, a healer whose medical authority the council could not dismiss, a community representative who had specific documented observations of boundary, manipulation, a 3-century-old witness with perfect recall of everything he had observed from above, and a folder of documents in her father's handwriting. She also had, she was aware, exactly 1 chance to do this correctly. The council session was standard format. Alpha Karan at the head of the table. Elder Baith to his right. 2 other council members, Sarah Whitfield and a younger wolf named Torvin across the table. The chamber was not large. It was a practical room, not a ceremonial one, which Seren had chosen deliberately. She had requested a working session rather than a formal hearing, because formal hearings had procedural protections that working sessions did not, and what she needed was the kind of room where documents could be placed on the table and read before anyone had time to invoke procedure. She placed the documents on the table. She said, "I was sent to the lowlands to investigate deaths that you already understood the source of. I found that source. I found considerably more." She did not look at Baith when she said this. She looked at Corin Mayle, who was looking back at her with an expression that was unreadable, but which contained, she thought, recognition. the recognition of someone who has been waiting for a particular kind of trouble and has just seen it arrive. I found documents in this pack's archive that are relevant to compact law violations going back to the era of Corvin Mail. I found correspondence that indicates those violations include the deliberate murder of a pack member 15 years ago. And I found a witness who has direct observational memory of the relevant events across the entire period in question. Coran Mail said, "This is a serious set of allegations to make without preparation for the consequence of making them." She said, "I have been preparing for 2 years without knowing I was preparing. Before that, my father was preparing for however long he had before you stopped him. The silence in the room was the kind of silence that precedes either the immediate invocation of authority or the cessation of performance. She watched Coran Mael, and she watched Elder Baith, and she watched the moment when Baith's expression shifted, and she knew, with the tracker's certainty, that it was the latter. Elder Baith said, "Where did you find these documents?" Orla, who was sitting in the corner of the room where Seren had placed her because she was 80 years old and entitled to a chair, said, "I will speak to the question of document provenance, Baith. And I will note that you're asking that question before asking about the content of the documents tells me something I have long suspected." Sarah Whitfield, who had been reading the documents with the focused expression of someone doing arithmetic, said, "The compact article violations documented here, if these are authentic." She stopped. She looked at Coran Mail. She looked back at the documents. She said, "Coran." Coran Mail was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "The seal in the eastern boundary is a legitimate compact measure." Calum spoke for the first time. He had been standing at the edge of the room in the particular quality of stillness that was, Seren had come to understand, his natural state, and when he spoke the quality of his voice in the room changed everything, not because it was loud or dramatic, it was neither, but because it had 3 centuries in it, and rooms can feel that whether they have been told to or not. He said, "I was present at the sealing. I can testify to the process by which it was conducted, the authority that was claimed to conduct it, and the illegitimacy of that authority under the compact articles I was myself subsequently sentenced under. I have perfect recall of every event I witnessed in this territory, from the year 1714 to the present day." Torvin said, "Who is this?" Seren said, "He is Calum Drevast, sentenced to observation by the Primordial Council 312 years ago for raising exactly the concerns we are raising today." Orla said, "I can authenticate the Drevast compact records. I have the originals, not the expurgated versions in the official archive. The originals, which I have been keeping in my personal collection for 20 years, because I found them in the predecessor archive before this building was constructed, and I knew they had been removed deliberately." The quality of the silence in the room changed again. Sarah Whitfield said, "Coran, the seal. Is it stable?" Coran Mail said nothing. Dewey, who was also in the room, said, "Based on what I have been told about the nature of the deterioration and the pattern of deaths in the lowlands, the seal has approximately 2 weeks of stability remaining. After that, the deterioration will become catastrophic. That is a medical assessment." He paused. "Whatever political considerations are on the table, the seal is the urgent practical matter." Coran Mael looked at Seren across the table and said, "You have put together something very comprehensive." She said, "My father taught me thoroughness." She watched him absorb this. She watched the particular absorption of a powerful man understanding that the story he has controlled for 15 years has been taken out of his control by someone he sent out of the territory precisely because he thought she was safely removed. She watched him understand that the room had changed around him in the time she had been speaking, that Sarah Whitfield was no longer looking at him as an authority figure, and was now looking at him as a problem, that Torvin was reading the documents with the expression of someone doing urgent recalculation, that Elder Beth was entirely still in the way of someone who has stopped performing composure. He said finally, "What do you want?" She said, "I want the seal opened through legitimate compact process, with a formal acknowledgement of the illegitimacy of its original creation. I want the compact articles violated in the bloodline suppression restored, and applied to all affected families retroactively. I want the murder of Aldrich Voss formally acknowledged and entered into the Pack's official record. And I want the council to make whatever decisions it needs to make about the individuals responsible." She paused. "I am not asking for punishment. I am asking for the record to reflect the truth." Torvin said, "I support the motion to address the seal immediately and open a formal review process for the historical allegations." He said it clearly and without hesitation, which was the kind of clarity that moves rooms, and Seren noted with the tracking part of herself that Torvin was worth remembering. Sarah Whitfield said, "Seconded." Elder Baith said nothing. He looked at the table. Corin Mayle said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "Open the seal. She wants to say something here about what it feels like to hear those words after 15 years, but she thinks you probably already know what it feels like. And this is the moment where I am going to ask you again to just leave a comment, even one word, because I want to know that you felt it too. And subscribe if you have not, because we have the seal to open yet, and I promise you it is worth staying for." They went to the eastern boundary at dawn the following day. The full council and Orla and Dewey and Cass, and the Eastern Valley families who Cass had gathered in the night, and Seren and Calum walked at the front of the group, not because they had appointed themselves to that position, but because the landscape arranged them there with the same inevitability that terrain arranges water into particular channels. The seal was exactly where Calum said it was, invisible to ordinary observation, a point in the mountain ridge above the eastern boundary line where the stone had a different quality under the hand than the stone around it, the quality of something that had been held very tightly for a very long time, and wanted, with a patience that matched its containment, to be released. Orla performed the formal compact declaration of illegitimacy, reading from the original documents in a clear voice that she pitched to carry across the assembled group. She cited the specific articles. She named the original violations. She said, in the formal language of compact law, that the authority used to place the seal was hereby determined to be illegitimate in its source, and that the seal was therefore dissolved by the authority of the restored compact. There was a moment of held breath. All of them, the mountain and the people on it, and the long cold air of the Draveth peaks in the early morning. Then the stone moved. It did not explode or shatter or release any of the dramatic violence that sealed things in stories are supposed to release. It moved the way old grief moves when it finally has permission. Slowly, from the inside, with a quality of careful unpacking of something that has been very compressed for a very long time, returning to its natural shape. The stone opened along a line that had no geological logic, but had a different kind of logic entirely. The logic of a container acknowledging that its contents belong outside rather than within. And from within the opening came the smell that Ida at the Crossroads Inn and the farmer at Varden's Cross had described. Cold and clean and very old, like the inside of a chamber that has not been opened in centuries. But here, in the context of the release rather than the deterioration, it was not frightening. It was the smell of something that had been patient for a very long time, that had waited without bitterness, that had been sustained by the land that knew it, and had finally been given permission to return. The guardian who emerged was not what any of them had expected. He was old in the way Calum was old, in the way that predated the ordinary markers of age, and he was large in the way the mountain was large, not physically exactly, but in the quality of his presence in the air around him. He stood at the threshold of the opened stone and looked out at the assembled pack, and at the mountain, and at the sky, and breathed, simply breathed, the first real breath in 312 years, and no one spoke. Then he looked at Seren. He said, in a voice that had the quality of the mountain stone itself, "You have your grandmother's hands. She used to open gates the same way, patient, complete, without hurry." Seren said, "Did you know my grandmother?" He said, "I knew your whole line. We were neighbors before the compact, before the suppression." She looked at him and felt the particular sensation of something clicking into alignment, the way a joint feels when it has been slightly displaced and returns to its proper position. a relief so complete that it takes a moment to recognize as such. She said, "Welcome back." He looked out at the Dreveth peaks and at, the morning sky, and at the territory that had held him for 3 centuries. And for the first time, his expression changed from the patient stillness of someone returned from a very long absence into something that was, despite everything, something close to peace. The deaths in the lowlands stopped that day. What came after was not simple, because nothing that involves institutional accountability and 3 centuries of suppressed history is simple. But Seren had known that and had planned for it. The formal review process was convened with Torvin and Sarah Whitfield leading and with Orla providing the documentary foundation that her 20 years of unofficial collection had made possible. Karan Mail resigned his position before the review concluded, which was read by the settlement as a tacit acknowledgement that was not quite a confession and was more than a denial. Elder Beth formally retired and did not dispute the review's findings. The review took 11 months, which was both a very long time and, given the scope of what was being reviewed, considerably faster than anyone had expected. The Asheville Pack's historical records were formally amended. The bloodline suppressions of the Corvin Mail era were acknowledged and declared compact violations. The families affected, those who still had representatives in the territory, and those whose descendants could be traced in the wider shifter community, were formally notified. The Voss bloodline, specifically, was documented in the compact record for the first time in 3 generations, with its primordial heritage correctly identified. Aldrich Voss was entered into the official pack record as a member who had been killed in the service of compact accountability, which was not justice in the complete sense. Justice in the complete sense was not available because he was still gone, but it was the truth, and the truth in the official record was something he had died trying to put there. Seren stood at the eastern boundary. On the day the amended records were formally ratified, and looked at the landscape that she had been walking for 2 years, and that had been her bloodline's landscape for much longer than that, and felt the particular quality of presence that she thought she understood now. Not just belonging, but continuity, being the current version of something that had been moving through this terrain for generations before her, that would move through it in generations after. Caleb found her there, which she had known he would, because he had been finding her at the eastern boundary for months now, the particular gravity of 2 people who have been in orbit of something together and keep returning to the point of origin. The runes on his skin had faded during the review process. Each completed formal acknowledgement of a compact violation dissolving a fragment of the original sentence, and by the time the last amendment was ratified, there were only traces left, the faintest marks along his forearms and the hollow of his throat, like watermarks in old paper. He stood beside her, and they looked out at the Dreveth peaks together, and he said, "There is a formal question I need to ask you." She said, "Ask." He said, "The Drevast sentence has been formally dissolved. The Compact Council of the current era has acknowledged its illegitimacy. I am, technically, for the first time in 312 years, without obligation." He paused. "I have been watching this territory for so long that I am not entirely sure what it means to choose a direction freely, but I know what direction I want to choose." Another pause, and in the pause was the particular quality she had come to know as his honest attention, the attention that did not perform and did not deflect. "If you are willing to be chosen." She was quiet for a moment, in the way she had learned to be quiet, letting the important silences be what they needed to be. Then she said, "You watched me for 5 weeks before you spoke to me. I have been watching you for 11 months. I think that constitutes a fair amount of mutual consideration." He said, "Is that a yes?" She said, "It is a tracker's yes, which means I have assessed the terrain, read all the available signs, and concluded that this is the correct direction." He was quiet for a moment. Then, and this was the first time she had heard it, he laughed, and it was not the laugh of someone who had forgotten how, but the laugh of someone who had not had reason to, and had just been given one, and it moved through the morning air of the Dreveth peaks, like something that had been waiting inside the stone for 3 centuries, alongside the guardian, patient and complete. She turned and looked at him, and felt the 9-year-old and the 24-year-old and the whole line of women before her with their grandmother's hands and their boundary-walking instincts, and their quiet competence and their refusal to accept the clean stories that powerful men told about how things had gone, all of them arriving simultaneously in the morning light of a mountain they had always belonged to. And she thought, this is what it feels like to be seen, not just by him, though him certainly, but by the place itself, by the history that had been watching for someone to come and read it correctly, and by her own life, which had been moving toward this longitude for 24 years without her knowing to call it a destination. She reached out and touched one of the fading rune marks on his forearm, very lightly, the way you touch something old and remarkable that you want to be sure is real. He turned his hand and held hers. The mountain was quiet around them, the good quiet of something that has been patient for a very long time, and has finally seen the thing it was waiting for arrive. If you made it here, you have been with this story from the mountains, to the archive, to the seal to this morning. And I want to say something to you directly. Thank you. This is the kind of story that requires you to stay, and you stayed, and that means something to me. Leave me a comment below with your favorite moment. Was it the archive? Was it the council chamber? Was it the moment Caleb moved because he understood she had been sent out of the territory alone? I want to know. And please, if you are not subscribed yet, this is the moment right now, because we are not done. The epilogue is below, and you are not going to want to miss it. 3 years after, the formal ratification of the amended records, the Asheville Pack elected its first council by popular vote of the adult pack members, a structure that had been proposed by Torvin and supported by the Eastern Valley families, and that replaced the hereditary alpha leadership model with a governance council of 7 elected members serving 4-year terms. The guardian of the eastern boundary, whose name in the Old Language translated approximately to holding the mountain, served as a non-voting advisor on matters of territorial history, a role he accepted with the same patient quality with which he had sustained himself in the sealed stone, and which he brought to every session with a precision that the elected council found invaluable. Orla finished her formal documentation of the Corvin Mile era bloodline suppressions at the age of 83 and presented it to the Primordial Council Archive, which had been formally reconstituted as an independent body rather than a subsidiary of Alpha Governance, and where it became a foundational document in the larger project of territorial historical correction that was, slowly and with considerable friction, beginning to move through the wider shifter community. Seren was appointed the Council's Director of Territorial Records and Boundary Standards, a role that was created specifically because no existing role covered what she actually did, and which involved not only the tracking work she had always done, but the formalization of boundary observation into a documented and legally actionable practice rather than an informal duty. She trained 2 junior trackers. She brought the same patience and precision to teaching that she brought to everything else. She occasionally stopped at the eastern boundary in the early mornings before the settlement woke, in the quiet that was the good kind now, and looked out at the Dreveth peaks, and let herself feel the continuity of being where she was supposed to be. Caleb, who had never had a home that was not the air above someone else's territory, had discovered that homes are built more than found, and was in the process of building one. He was, Seren observed with the attention she gave to all things she tracked carefully, an excellent builder in the literal sense, which made sense given that he had spent 3 centuries observing human construction from above, but was working out the metaphorical sense with the same diligence he had applied to everything since his sentence ended. He was learning what it meant to choose to stay. She was learning what it meant to let someone choose to stay. These were, they had discovered, complementary educations. On the morning of the autumn equinox, 3 years after the seal opened, she woke before the frost had thawed and went to the eastern boundary and found him there already, watching the sun come up over the Dreveth peaks with the attentive stillness she knew, as well as she knew her own breathing. She stood beside him, and he turned and looked at her, and the rune marks on his forearms were almost gone, the last traces fading slowly in the mountain air, and his amber eyes caught the early light and held it the way they had the first morning she had looked at him across a fire in the dark and understood that she was not talking to a bird. He said, I watched a sunrise every morning for 3 centuries and never had someone to show it to. She said, "How is it different?" He said, "It is the same sunrise." A pause. "And it is entirely different." She looked at the peaks and at the light, and at the territory that was her bloodlines and her packs, and was also, she knew now, a living thing, a continuous thing, a thing that had been holding both of them in its attention for much longer than they had been holding each other. She thought about her father, who had been thorough and patient, and had looked at the world like he was about to find something true in it. She thought about the 9-year-old who had waited 15 years for the record to be corrected, and had finally, in a council chamber with documents on a table, seen it happen. She thought about 3 centuries of watching from above, and one choice, finally, to speak. She said, "Same sunrise, entirely different." He took her hand. The mountain was quiet around them, the peaks lit gold by the equinox light, and the eastern boundary stretched away in both directions, marking the edge of a territory that had, at long last, its full history. Return to it. This is the end of tonight's story. I am so glad you were here for it. I want to know what stayed with you, what you are still thinking about, what you want to see next. The comments are open and I read every single one, so talk to me. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something in that particular place where stories land, share it with someone who needs it tonight. And if you are not yet subscribed, truly, what are we waiting for? The button is right there, and I will see you in the next story. Until then, take care of each other out there.